I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now. Hannah Arendt witnessed the rise of Nazism in Germany, and her groundbreaking works, including the Origins of Totalitarianism, sought to understand how regular people could be seduced by horrendous ideologies such as antisemitism and fascism. In this episode, we learn all about it because I speak with documentarian Jeff Bieber, whose new film, Hannah Arendt Facing Tyranny, documents Arendt's life as an intellectual, refugee, and eventually an American citizen whose concerns about power, they're going to sound familiar to you. The documentary, Hannah Arendt Facing Tyranny, is currently streaming on pbs.org, and I think if you guys are as into this conversation as I was, you're going to want to check it out. The link for that is in the episode description. Happy July 4th this week, everybody. Special thanks to all the patrons who keep us going. We hope you guys travel safe or stay at home safe or whatever you do. We just hope that you take some time to appreciate this republic, this constitution we have. And hey, instead of just celebrating all the people who birthed it into this world, let's be good stewards to it so we may pass it along to our children. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show. The documentary is about Hannah Arendt, who is this larger-than-life intellectual figure who really lives the mid-20th century, early to mid-20th century.
Right.
And out of that develops, I think, a deep sense of wisdom, a deep sense of empathy. And what I think, it's very controversial, but I think that she understands people in a way that no one wants to hear. And we see this later on in her career. And she got a masterclass in it just by being born she's got a masterclass in it for all those things you can't control. When you're born, where you're born, who your parents are, how people perceive you in a broader sense. And so for folks who are listening who don't know Hannah Arendt, could you just start off by telling us who she is? You know, why would you make a documentary about Hannah Arendt?
Well, those are two different questions. First, I'll tell you who. So Hannah Arendt, born in Hanover, Germany in 1906. So right around the turn of the 20th century, born to a enlightened middle-class Jewish family. Enlightened meaning that, they were secular Jews. They were not necessarily religious Jews, even though her grandfather was, I think, head of the, Jewish synagogue in Königsberg, where she grew up. She, at age 12 or 14, gets into reading philosophers like Kant, Nietzsche, and philosophers. And, in a way, she's a child prodigy. The other thing about her is that when World War I breaks out in 1914, she and her father had passed away. She and her mother are forced to flee to Berlin. And World War I, as she says, creates this kind of firestorm. It's an eruption that doesn't stop. And it changes everything. She goes to University of Marburg to study philosophy, meets her mentor and who becomes a lover, Martin Heidegger, professor of philosophy.
Mind-blowing. I didn't know about this.
Yeah, Martin Heidegger is really one of the founders of existentialism. He talks about being in time, and you could be who you, and so he opens doors for her in terms of, her developing her thinking, if you will. But he's, a 35-year-old married guy with two kids, and she had just turned 18 when she went to school, and they have an affair. Anyway, long story short, she moves to Berlin, cuts off a relationship with him, marries a nice Jewish boy, if you will, who all studied with Heidegger, and starts to see what's happening in Germany in 1929. Stock market crashes 1 month after they get married, and she starts to see cracks opening up in this kind of Weimar Republic, where this man, Adolf Hitler, comes on the scene, starts blaming immigrants and Jews for, all the social ills that's going on. Anyway, long story short, she renounces philosophy, renounces the ivory tower philosophy, if you will, after the Reichstag burns in 1933, and kind of plants her feet firmly on the ground sees what's in front of her and starts becoming involved in politics. She joins the resistance. She starts to expose anti-Semitism propaganda that the Nazis are putting out there that the rest of the world's not seeing. She gets arrested by the Gestapo, gets out, escapes to France, joins a new organization at the time called Youth Aliyah to help Jewish German kids escape to what was then Palestine. Spends a couple of months in Palestine. And then when Germany attacks France, she gets arrested again, in turn, because she's a German citizen. Um, Escapes again, and ultimately moves to the United States with her, at that time, second husband. There's a lot of personal things going on in her life at the time. Um, and in 1943, when she starts to learn, the rest of the world starts to learn about Auschwitz and the killing centers, she starts asking these questions. What happened? Why did this happen? How did it happen? And she starts writing this book that ultimately is published as Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951. So that, Hannah Arendt essentially is a complicated figure. You can't draw a straight line in her life where she goes from point A to point B. She takes a lot of roads all over the place, and incorporates in her writing philosophy, political philosophy, literature, and her own experience. One of the things she says, all thinking comes from your experience. In order to understand what you're experiencing, you have to see what's in front of you, see reality in front of you. And she incorporates all of that in the book Origins of Totalitarianism and subsequent books that she writes about in the United States.
Right. This is that influence of existentialism on her, right? I mean, this idea that one's experience shapes what one can understand, which is very much, as you said, goes back to Heidegger. So she has this life, and there's some key moments that I think we should talk about. I mean, there's more than we could cover here, which is great because you all should watch the documentary, which premieres on, or has premiered by the time you listen to this, on June 27th, and it will be available on PBS, the PBS app streaming. So make sure you check it out. One of the things we're gonna have to skip over, I think, that's unfortunate, is like the impact of World War I on her. I mean, we think about it in the United States, we have a very different experience because we know there's the backlash afterwards, but we don't think about sometimes what it's like to live in Germany, where there's tensions boiling, where as things come back together, they seem to still be falling apart. But you point out there's this moment from 1929 to 1933 where she watches it happen. She sees the boiling tension under the surface, and Mein Kampf is published, and she's up against this this force that she really struggles to wrap her head around. You present a certain perspective that she has on how it is that between 1929 and 1933, this by all accounts figure, Adolf Hitler, who does not represent the majority at all, manages to become someone that has the power that he has. Could you talk about Hannah's experience with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So after World War One, so Germany loses World War One, and out of that, Treaty of Versailles strips Germany of its military, demilitarizes Germany, forces Germany to pay reparations to the victors of that war, and it causes hyperinflation and unemployment. So people were angry, and they were looking for somebody to blame. The other thing, though, is that Hannah Arendt, this is what she observes later when she comes to New York, but she experiences this, is that she writes about something called existential loneliness. Okay. So in 2023, I have to digress a little bit. The Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, issues a report that there's an epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And basically what he says is what Hannah Arendt says of what she observes between 1929 and 1933, which is that people felt a sense of loneliness, a sense of being disconnected to their former lives, right? There was unemployment. There was a massive refugee crisis after World War I. They were seeing all these foreign people taking away their jobs. At least they felt that. And they wanted to belong again. And this guy, Adolf Hitler, comes on the scene and says, look, I'm going to provide meaning to your life. I'm going to provide jobs again. I'm going to rebuild the military. In essence, I'm going to make Germany great again. And they believe his conspiracy theories of blaming the Jews for doing all of this to us. And she observes this as she asks the question, how can ordinary people, right? Accountants, teachers, bookkeepers, good people who mow the lawn, go to Sunday school, teach Sunday school rather, go to church or whatever. How could they subscribe to these conspiracy theories? And what she realizes is that these people were looking for meaning in their life,
Mm-hmm.
and they believe the strong man, cult figure, Adolf Hitler, who comes on the scene and says, I'm going to provide all these things back to you again. And so essentially, she makes meaning of this afterwards, but she experiences it while she's there.
Yeah, it's hard not to see parallels, I think, for a lot of us. And it's one of these things where we talked about recently during our live show about how hard it is to teach sometimes, because the parallels that are there, people think you're trying to make a point, and you're not trying to make a point. You're simply recounting the story from the past.
Right.
And I mean, the stories, themselves have power. And this is what's fascinating to me is this thing she witnesses, which is this story that Hitler tells. This story that he tells, as inaccurate as it is, it's a fantasy, right? One of the scholars, in Roger Berkowitz, you interview in this, says, it's a fantasy, but sometimes that's what people want. And he tells this story, and the points where people who had felt disengaged from politics come back in. He was deliberately speaking to people that other parties had given up on. All of these things, and you realize there's some power in that, right? Nefarious or not, speaking to people, it would be a good idea if those with non-nefarious intentions learned something about speaking to people who feel left out. But she sees it, and one of the things that she evolves in this time period and kind of in her life is her relationship to being Jewish,
right?
Which she herself, she doesn't see that as a defining figure of herself, or a feature of herself early on. Could you talk about how she comes to recognize this, and she recognizes she has to embrace this. She has to recognize her Jewishness because everyone else does.
Right. Well, that's a fascinating point. It's a little known point about Hannah Arendt. Essentially, when she was a teenager, she was good friends with another girl, Anne Mendelssohn, who happened to be the great or the granddaughter of Moses Mendelssohn, great Jewish philosopher. And Anne gives Hannah these diaries, letters in a book form by a Jewish woman who lived in the late 18th, early 19th century named Rachel von Hagen. And, she kind of puts it away when she goes to school, but takes it out in 1928, 1929, and starts doing research on this woman who was born Jewish, but wanted to fit in to German society. So what she does, this woman, Rachel, what she finds out from her letters and all that, she marries a non-Jew, converts to Christianity, opens a salon. But all along, what she gets out of the letters that Rachel says is, no matter how hard I tried to fit in, I was always seen as the Jew. I was always a Jew. And basically, what she gets out of that is she sees a lot of German Jews at the time who had converted. A lot of famous Jews converted. Gustav Mahler converted to Lutheranism to fit in, to be able to, be part of German society. And what she realizes when she sees the growing anti-Semitism and Hitler railing against the Jews is that assimilation, Jewish assimilation in Germany was a failure. It was an illusion. And yet a lot of people who said, I fought in World War I, I'm a good German, they felt nothing's going to happen to me. So she says, if you're attacked as a Jew, you have to defend yourself as a Jew, not as a world citizen, not as an upholder of the rights of man, but you have to defend yourself as a Jew. And it's not that she subscribes to being, a religious Jew. And even when she takes kids to Palestine to escape, because in 1938, all countries cut off the doors to immigration, including the United States, after the Avion Conference. But basically, she says Jews, like other people, need a homeland. And what she means by that is they need to be involved in politics. The other point I really want to make here is that she felt that a Jewish homeland in Palestine needed to be a federation with Jews and Arabs living together. She subscribed to this political party of creating a commonwealth. And she felt that if Israel was created as a Jewish state and pushed the Arabs away, just like she heard Ben Gurion, talk about in the early days of the formation of the Jewish state, it would become a nation state similar to Germany, similar to other nation states, where you had to be whether white and Aryan or white and Jewish to fit in. So she was very prescient about her what she wrote about being Jewish, but also creating a homeland for Jews.
Yeah, there is in this. You don't cover it in the documentary, and it's broad. But I think when you go back and you look at the ideas of what a Jewish homeland or what an Israel could be early on, is like the ideas are incredible. And we so often we look at the present and we cast it over the past. And what Israel is now, whatever you think about it, it was one of many ideas by people who deeply cared about the region and deeply cared about creating a place they could feel comfortable, which makes sense because, the Holocaust is not the first time by far that Jewish people living in a European or other environment find themselves the victims of attack simply because other people see them as the other. And there's a long history to that as well. I think sometimes we forget the pogroms and all of this in the Russian Empire. So it's something she has to live with, and I think by embracing that, she has to wrap her head around that deeper history. So she's there and she sees these folks the rise of the Nazis, and there's this formative point where she sees that even Heidegger, once the Nazis take over, it's like make the point overnight, the Reichstag fire, right, February 27th, 1933. The next day, it's completely different. And the intellectuals collapse. The German intellectuals just go. They overnight. They are suddenly Nazis. And Heidegger, her former lover, her key figure in her intellectual development, just falls right in line. Turns his university into the German University for the Nazi Party, and just swallows the whole thing. And could you talk about her response to seeing this and seeing her colleagues suddenly buy into this story that she knows they can't possibly believe, and yet they do?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible turning point in her life. Essentially, as you mentioned, in February 1933, the Reichstag burns, and Hitler and the Nazis blame the communists because the communists were a rival party. Actually, they wanted to get out of the way. And after that occurs in March of 1933, Hitler declares martial law. He's already the chancellor in January, declares martial law. And communists, including her first husband, are forced to flee. And she sees friends and colleagues taken into the Gestapo, into concentration camps, Dachau. But she also sees her friends and colleagues become Nazis. She said, at the time, there was no forced terror to become a Nazi. But people like Martin Heidegger becomes a Nazi. And he's at the time the rector of the University of Freiburg. And he signs a memo that not only expels Jewish students from studying at the University of Freiburg, he expels Jewish faculty, including his mentor, Karl Husserl. So she renounces Heidegger. She cuts off all ties to him. And at the time, then, that's what gets her to change or turn to the political. She renounces the ivory tower philosophy that she studies. And instead, she says, I'm going to focus my mind, my eyes, my body on what's happening in front of me. And she becomes actively involved in, at that time, joining the resistance, in helping people escape. And essentially, she then becomes a political theorist, as she called herself. But in reality, she was a practicing a political activist, if you will.
And she's in journalism. She's trying to spread the word to people. She's trying to get it out there. So she writes for newspapers. That's why she,
Right.
in 1929, I believe it is, she moves to Berlin, correct? And
Right.
she's writing there. And so
Right.
she decides to use that skill set she has with both a thinker and a writer to try to spread the word. And it's not easy for her.
No, what she's recruited by this Zionist organization in Germany. Karl Blumenfeld was a dear, dear friend and mentor to her, who headed the German Zionist organization, and he recruited her to spy on the Nazis and expose what was called the horror propaganda, the anti-Semitic propaganda that was being put out by institutions, not just by the government, but by institutions, colleges, because at the time, Hitler took over civil society, took over colleges, took over, if you will, NGOs at the time, took over all aspects of society, and those parts of society were putting out anti-Semitic propaganda. So she wanted to expose that, and she gets arrested by the Gestapo and held for 8 days and questioned. And eventually they let her go, and she escapes to France. But yeah, I mean, so the burning of the Reichstag and what happens to all these intellectuals who she claimed rationalized Nazism to fit their own, theory for survival or for advancement, was just awful. And she sees that and she acts accordingly.
Yeah. And, you talk about her getting out, escaping. The story of them looking through her notebooks and not knowing what she wrote and her being like, that's Greek. And they somehow believe it. There's an even more crucial escape she has when she's actually put into a camp.
Right.
Prior to the actual, the Nazis taking the camp over. Could you talk about that escape she has? And, some people decide to stay behind. She
Right.
goes. And then what the story is after that.
So in 1940, basically, just to give you a little bit of backstory. So in the 1930s, she and her first husband separate, and he escapes to the United States. She could not get out. And she meets this guy, Heinrich Blücher, not Jewish, self-taught guy, German as well, former communist. And they fall in love and ultimately marry in 1940. And then that spring, Germany invades France. And at the time, France then has all German citizens or nationals to report to an internment camp. And Hannah and Heinrich are separated. And Hannah's sent down by train to a camp called Gurs camp in the south of France with all these other women and many German Jewish women at the time. And it was at that camp, it was pretty awful. It was an internment camp. It was not a German. It was run by the French. But people died of dysentery. People were fed meager
They did
food.
horrible things, and this is like pre-Nazi takeover, doing horrible things like throwing one loaf of bread over the wall, and having them fight over it.
Yeah.
It's brutal.
It is pretty brutal. And it was at that time she writes to, actually, I think it was Kurt Blumenfeld much later, that she contemplated suicide. And she once said, she was very ironic. And she said, if history was not that awful, it would be a joy to live. So basically, when the Nazis are coming up to the camp, and France falls to Germany, there's chaos ensues in the camp. And there were these women who were creating these kind of false papers to get out. And she joins these basically about 100 women. There were about 3,000 women in this camp to escape. And she does escape. And she ultimately ends up in the city called Montauban in France, where she runs into Heinrich, who had also gotten out. But so they eventually escape with the help of Varian Fry, which is not in the film, to the United States in 1941. But 3,000 women who were left in that camp were sent to Auschwitz by Adolf Eichmann.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Hannah Arendt, in many ways, what can I say? Incredibly courageous person who, by whatever means, escaped potential death, both when she was arrested by the Gestapo and when she escaped from the clutches of the Nazis taking over Gurs camp.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. You know, it's like it had all these turns. It could have ended up like it did for so many people, and
Right.
it's just a tragedy because first you think, wow, how fortunate she was, and then you think about the greater tragedy that still befell so many of these people.
Right.
She comes to the United States, and one of the things, at least I found in her in this move and her decision later on to become an American citizen, is that she, having been through all of what she saw and having been through, you know, into this ethnically defined identity, she comes to the United States and she really appreciates the beauty of what this country can be.
Mm-hmm.
A country, for all its flaws, that doesn't define identity based on bloodline, you know, ideally, and a republic and a place where, you know, there's just a different, we have our nationalism, again, we have our problems, but she really appreciated this republic for what it was. And could you talk about that? Because I think there's something beautiful in this, but there's also this thing that we forget so many times, which is just having a founding documents, a founding story that isn't about bloodline, even though some people try to make it that way. It's not about bloodline. And just the potential and the possibilities that are afforded people who live here that aren't in so much of the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, she comes here in the spring of 1941. And another thing that's not in the film, just too much, it was too
Yeah.
much to fit in, is she gets a job as a housekeeper working for a couple who live in Massachusetts
Really?
to make a little money and learn English. And what she observes when Pearl Harbor is attacked in November 1941 is this couple starts writing letters to their congressman about, objecting to the incarceration of Japanese and Japanese Americans. And she wonders, man, here's this, ordinary people who are becoming involved in politics, who don't fear any fear of writing to their political leaders to express their anger or disappointment in what's happening in their country. And what she comes to realize about what she called the American Republic is that it is a country of immigrants. It's a country where she says, the natives were the Native American population, but everybody else was an immigrant who come to this country and they're not bound by who they are, their bloodline. They're not bound by, their religion, right? But the only thing that binds these people is the Constitution. And she's just fascinated by it because she realizes she just loves the fact that here's a system of government with three equal branches of government and a very decentralized government with states' rights. And she's fascinated by that this American public really has the possibility of succeeding, of providing people with freedom. And freedom was defined by being who you are. She defined freedom as, it could contain good people and bad people you don't agree with, people you agree with. But that's what true freedom is all about. It's about plurality. Plurality, not just in terms of um, what you look like, what you believe, but plurality in your thought. And so it was not a homogenous thing. She didn't consider America a nation state that was bound by blood and soil as the Aryan,
Right.
but she considered it a place that honored people based on the Constitution.
Yeah. And this is where, you know, all questions have, you know, we're all biased and, you know, everyone is. And my bias is I think that sometimes we forget the beauty in being in a place like this where you, if we do it right, you have this freedom. And it always worries me when I see people forgetting that. And nobody recognized that more than a person who had been on the other end of this and seen what the logic is of this exclusionary way of doing things, and seeing that that logic almost always leads to purges, to separation, to awful things. And so I think, you know, sometimes we lose these generations who lived it and we forget but she's a good reminder of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I could jump ahead though, when McCarthyism breaks out though,
Yes, that's what I was going to say
that's
next.
when, so in 1950, Joseph McCarthy, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin starts holding these hearings to weed out, as he said, communists in the State Department and in other places of society. And her husband, who had been a communist, is really afraid of because they're going after people. And they're, canceling people, if you will, arresting people. And so she takes this on. Whereas, many other immigrants, especially Jewish German immigrants, wouldn't take on something like this. They would just want to kind of stay in their place. She takes it on in an essay, and writes about the dangers of McCarthy. She said, they went after people without the use of terror, without the use of force. They arrested people. People became informants. Informants became ingrained in society. And she writes an essay called "The Ex-Communists" about how people who were communists start becoming informants for McCarthy. And she said that fear was struck in universities. She was teaching at Berkeley at the time. And she said there was a chill in the campus. There was a chill in the entertainment community because of what was happening. So she calls this out, and it's one of the fault lines that she sees, the cracks in her beloved American Republic that could kind of turn the Republic into a fascist state. And that's one of the many things we could talk about in terms of where she sees the dangers that are kind of lurking beneath the surface of, the American Republic.
Yeah, and this is something that's very concerning to her because she herself has seen a republic fall to a dictatorship.
Right.
In 51, she publishes this famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And I've got to say, for a long time, I kind of, my gut reaction to the phrase totalitarianism was get rid of it. I felt like, because as someone who spent a lot of time studying Soviet history and the historiography, how we've talked about, and not even just the historiography, but the evolution of the way we talk about, particularly the Soviet Union. The phrase totalitarianism, as it was used by a lot of people, was used to group together Nazis and communists. It had a political purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But having read Yuval Noah Harari's most recent book, I think he's revived it for me in the sense that it can be a useful tool to explain the ways that a government or a party decides that all aspects of your life have to be determined by the party line. And so when she writes this book, she really describes this new thing, which is all aspects of your life have to perform loyalty. And this is, we look back at the 50s, and people see everybody with their tucked in shirts and dressing the same and all of this. And I think people forget how much of that was a response to McCarthyism. Mm-hmm. By outwardly showing that you were an American, that you were loyal, you could perhaps avoid questioning, at a time when everyone knew it didn't matter whether you were a communist. If someone said you were in trouble. So could we talk about like her writing on totalitarianism and the big, idea behind her book, Origins of Totalitarianism?
Let me tell about, you mentioned totalitarianism in relationship to, different states. So she writes about there's a public sphere, a private sphere, a social sphere. And she said, the tyrant, who a fascist, she writes, wants to control the public sphere. Right? They want to control civil society, cultural centers, universities, government, the courts. So the public infrastructure is replaced by a belief in a strong man. And political parties are replaced by mass movements, right? But then what she says is the totalitarian leader wants to control the private sphere, how you think. They want to control everything about you. So you have to subscribe to everything of the totalitarian leader, and ultimately, in a totalitarian state, human beings become superfluous to the state. So in other words, Jews, Roma, others who didn't subscribe, who were seen as inferior um, to the state or to the Aryan nation, were deemed superfluous and they were killed, basically. And even Nazis ultimately could become superfluous. So totalitarianism is a kind of an extreme form that she comes up with because she sees in Hitler's Germany and in Stalin's Soviet Union that people become superfluous and millions and millions and millions of people are killed. In America, um, she's always on the lookout for what's happening, and it starts with McCarthyism in terms of these cracks in American democracy that instead of having due process, right, they just go after people, and all of a sudden people become canceled, or people. And she was afraid, and her husband was afraid that he could be deported as he said, a stroke of a pen for not being a good American, for being a communist or an ex-communist.
And they were afraid, but she had become an American citizen in 1951, and there begins talk about denaturalizing naturalized citizens.
Right.
And this to me is like, that's strikingly terrifying, that one could become a part, right? Because the idea is that if you come here, you play by the rules, you say, I want to be an American, you can be, and that's something that can't be taken away. And only at our worst moments have we seen these questions, these things be drawn into question.
Well, I want to bring up a point. So she talks about stateless people. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws um, become the practice of Germany, in which she and other Jewish German Jews are denied citizenship in Germany. So she becomes, in essence, a stateless person. She's a stateless person for 18 years. And what she observes is that stateless people have no rights, that they're dependent on the state. Um, and, they could be deported at the stroke of a pen. So what she really, talks about is that citizens, um, you know, um, the state has all the rights. So this kind of rights of man, so to speak, um, is a document that really doesn't have meaning to a lot of people. And so the state can deport people that they deem a threat to society. And she begins to see that in this country, starting with McCarthyism.
Yeah. So much we could get into with all of this. There's two things I really want to talk about.
Right.
And I think the biggest one is 1961 with the trials in Israel.
Right.
Particularly the trial of Adolf Eichmann, which you cover pretty intensely in this. And you have him talking and his explanation. Eichmann goes on trial, this guy who's like the architect of so much of Nazi Germany. And his defense is, I was just following orders. When I sent these people, I had no say-so. I followed orders. I believed it. And he even says, I would have followed orders no matter what. My only regret would have been if I didn't follow orders. He says he would have sent other Nazis to the concentration. He would have sent his family if he was ordered to do so. And he tells the story in which he himself is in no way culpable. He's just as responsible as anyone putting stamps on envelopes. Arendt covers this in 1961, and the way she covers it gets her absolutely skewered.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about this story? Because this to me was fascinating, and I think she was right about what she said. But it was deeply thoughtful by someone who later realized that Eichmann himself was responsible for the death of the people in the camp that she would have been in if she hadn't escaped.
Yeah.
So she's not outside of this. Could you talk about that some?
Yeah. Well, to this day, her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil is quite controversial. People are still angry over that book. Essentially, in 1960, the Israeli government captures Adolf Eichmann in Argentina and brings him to Jerusalem to stand trial. So she hears about this and asks Wallace Shawn, who's the editor of the New Yorker, if she could go cover the trial, and he agrees. to let her go, and pays her expenses to go cover the trial. And as she says to her dear friend, the writer Mary McCarthy, she got out of Germany in 1933, and she really wanted to see a Nazi in the flesh. She wanted to see someone in person who had been part of this totalitarian system. Adolf Eichmann was kind of what one of our scholars called Hitler's chief logician. He was in charge of transportation, transporting people from ghettos to concentration camps to extermination camps. That's what he did. Um, and she goes and she expects to see kind of a raving lunatic, a mad anti-Semite. Instead, what she sees is this bespectacled guy coming in a suit, tie, constantly blowing his nose because he has some sort of cold. Um, and a guy who's talking in what we would call Nazi speak, cliches, saying, well, my job was to transport people from here to there. I worked with all these other people. I signed these papers. That's what I did. That's what I'm guilty of. I didn't kill anybody, and that's what I did. And I followed the laws of the Third Reich, right? I obeyed the laws of the Third Reich. Um, and what she comes to realize is that out of Eichmann, she coins this phrase banality of evil, in essence. And what she's saying is that it's not that evil is banal, but what she's saying is that the job that Eichmann had, the common job of transporting people from here to there, he failed to think about what he was doing. He lacked empathy. He failed to see what his actions actually caused, which was the death of millions of people. And then she comes to realize that there were thousands of people like Adolf Eichmann. There's a book called Ordinary Men,
Yeah.
and it's about a group of men from one town in Germany who were recruited in 1941 to join the mobile killing squads of the Nazis, the Einsatzgruppen. And they're ordinary men, they're teachers, accountants, they mow their lawn, they teach Sunday school, and they're recruited, and they become part of a mobile killing squad. They kill thousands of people, thousands of Jews and others. And then after their job is done, they go back to their lives as ordinary men. They become good citizens of Germany. And what she realizes is that this was what the totalitarian system created. And it wasn't, as she said, radical evil, what she coined in Origins of Totalitarianism. What she realized afterwards was that evil was created by ordinary people, right? Who just subscribed to a system where in Germany, instead of observing thou shalt not kill, Germany was thou shalt kill. Um, and then, so that's one part of it. The other part of it is they also bring Jewish survivors of the camps and the ghettos and others to testify against Adolf Eichmann. And some of these people were the heads of these Jewish councils in ghettos who cooperated with Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann would identify leaders of the Jewish community, and he would create what we call the Judenräte, or Jewish councils, and they would provide Eichmann with lists. Eichmann would say, well, I want to deport 2,000 people. And they would give him a list of, here are the people you should deport. Here are the people that you should save, not deport. Here we will give out the yellow star to people. And what she says is that even uh, Jews were swept into this totalitarian system. So that instead of being passive and not cooperating, instead of resisting, they cooperated. And she called this one of the darkest days of Jewish history. Then when the book was published, oh my God, it was a firestorm of she was just vilified, crucified by the Jewish intelligentsia and others for basically saying that you're accusing the Jews of killing all these people in the Holocaust while you're exonerating Eichmann as being banal. How dare you be judge of a Jews who were caught in a horrible situation? So She she was just pilloried, and but she didn't backtrack on what she wrote, and ultimately, at the end of the day, a lot of her theories are completely accurate about the banality of evil.
Yeah, I think this is one of those things where I'm looking at it, and she was thoughtful about it. I mean, one of the things she recognized was that her audience in America, the stuff she published first in the New Yorker, they were just learning about the horrors, whereas she had lived them, like she had seen them, and to her, she had processed it. To a lot of people, seeing this trial and as they're processing it, telling them, a story that is very, I mean, very easily, if someone didn't like it, they could summarize it very pejorative way, which is Eichmann says he's just doing his job, and Hannah Arendt says, yeah, he's just doing his job, without really getting into her deep empathy and her ability to even find empathy in this person who, by all accounts, has done horrible things. It's a surprising thing, but it yields these results, and I think they're key to the way that I understand the world and try to teach history, which is every generation has a worst person. It could be you. It's got to be somebody. It could be you. You've got to recognize that inside of you lives the best and the worst person. And that these evil people, we want to look back at them and like they go home like super villains and look at themselves in the mirror like, ha, 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 and but they don't. They go home and they play with their kids. And I think that like her saying, everyone, if you're not careful, this could happen to you. Because it is banality, right? There's a logic to it that you can embrace. And if you cut off certain elements of yourself and you cut off certain elements of your feeling, you will just go do your job and say it's just your job regardless of the outcome. And I think that there's power in that. But at the same time, I also understand why people said it just sounds like you're saying what he's saying if you don't scratch deeper. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, can I just say a couple of more things about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, essentially, she was very angry at the Israeli prosecutor, Hausner, because Hausner was trying to paint Eichmann as the evil criminal based in 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, Jewish history, like Haman during the Purim story and all those other things. And what she said is he got it all wrong, that Eichmann wasn't necessarily a great political criminal, but instead he created great political crimes. But he was this ordinary schmuck, if you will,
Yeah.
who wanted to get ahead. And there were thousands of people like him. And the other part of the book is she wrote it with a lot of irony.
Yeah.
And yeah, people were really off put by the tone of her book. But one of the things one scholar did say to us is she was also really angry, very angry because people forget she too was a survivor.
Yeah.
Um, and Yeah, so it brought up a huge emotional backlash against her. And one of the things we do reveal in the film is it really did cause her a lot of pain
Yeah.
at the time, a lot of pain.
Yeah. And nevertheless, I think it stands. And one of the points she had observed earlier, which was the people that were moving up in the Nazi ranks, they weren't these masterminds. They weren't these brilliant people. In fact, brilliant creative people are a threat to a system like that. You need to promote people who are undynamic and uncreative and won't challenge anything because you need them just to follow the party line. And I think in a way she felt offended that these people were made out to be in these like larger than life bad guys when in fact they were, like you said, they're just schmucks. They're like, they got there because they were so uncreative. They got there because they were just so bland.
I mean, the totalitarian system or fascists don't want people to think, and she said thinking to them is dangerous. Thinking
Yeah.
is dangerous. They don't want you to think. And that was one of the, hallmarks of the totalitarian system.
Yeah. So she goes through this. It's very hard on her. And it's amazing because she lives until 75, right? Like she's there. And one of the things, and you'll see this when you watch the documentary, Hannah Arendt Facing Tyranny, you'll see way more than we can cover here. She is one of these people I admire because she never stopped growing intellectually. she never did the thing that so many of us do, which is, I figured it out. I wrote a book, people. I'm a famous scholar. Like I'll stick with this my whole life, which is so much of thinking, even to the people who think that they're well above it. But she evolved, and she saw what was happening with the anti-Vietnam War protests, and again, she felt this concern. Could you talk about her involvement with that and how that helped her? She continued to grow during this period.
Yeah, so she starts teaching at the New School for Social Research in 1967, and a lot of her students are involved in the student protest movement. Um, and Leon Botstein tells a story. It's not in the film. I had to cut it out. He was at the University of Chicago at the time. Actually, this is before 67, and she's teaching there.
So this guy, Leo Botstein, I want to interject here and say this is one of her students.
Yeah, Leon Botstein, who's president of Bard College, was one of Hannah Arendt's students when he was 16 years old at the University of Chicago. Um, and he was involved in a sit-in to protest the war. And she attends the sit-in because she really loved the civil disobedience movement. She felt that's when people could come together politically for change, for positive change, civil disobedience. Um, but what she also witnesses when the Pentagon Papers is released in June of 1971, she and everybody else sees that the government had been lying, not just during the Nixon administration, but for decades, with many generations about the Vietnam War. When the government said, oh, we're winning, they were really losing that war.
Mm-hmm.
And she asked the question, why would they lie like this to their own people? And she realizes that they lied to save face. They wanted to project an image of like Pax Americana, we're really strong, when in fact they weren't. This massive power, superpower, was losing to this third world country in Vietnam. And then, so she was really afraid also when the civil disobedience movement turned into violence, especially in 1968 with the assassinations of Martin Luther King um, and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. She was really afraid that violence would lead to fascism. And when the government sends the National Guard to universities, to Kent State in Ohio, and 4 students are killed by the National Guard, she felt that was a huge fault line. And she writes about that. And then when the Watergate erupts in June of 72, she realizes that if tyranny, she says this to a television interviewer in 1973. She says, the founding fathers never believed that tyranny could arise out of the executive office. But she realizes after Watergate that if tyranny is going to arise in the United States, it's going to come from the executive, of the powers that they want to try and take. That's unconstitutional. So in her very last speech, Home to Roost, which was given in the Boston Forum in April 1975, the bicentennial forum, the bicentennial was celebrated from April 75 to July 4th, 1976. She warns us about not seeing what's in front of us, not seeing the facts of whether it's Watergate, whether it's McCarthyism, whether it's fascism, whether it's government lying to you. And instead of hiding into your, ordinary lives or, rationalizing why things are happening, you got to see these facts for what they are. And you got to become politically active to save the republic.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of end of this program and kind of end of her life, if you will.
Yeah, it was funny to me. She said the founders never saw tyranny coming from the executive, and I'm like, that's where they were the most terrified of it. But they thought they had built something that could keep that in check. And
right.
The reason they were able to for so long was because they were diligent and they understood. There was this lesson that had come from the revolution, which was you don't want one person to have that much power. A lesson that I think she was right to remind us of, and one that, unfortunately, I feel like we have forgotten hard lately. I saw, I think the funniest tweet I've seen recently was somebody saying, it's a good thing Congress isn't alive to see all this.
Right.
And I should attribute that. I can't remember who posted it, but Yeah, and we're left with a story of a person whose formative years were in watching the evolution of Nazism, watching how it evolved, and a person who, the end of their life, always loved this country, always loved the Republic, what it could be. And like so many of these great last lessons left by, giants in the world of thinking, we promptly forgot it. And I think it's a good time to remember it. Jeff, I've got so many questions about documentary making and all this stuff. I think we should leave it here for everyone to go back and see. The documentary is Hannah Arendt, Facing Tyranny. It's available streaming on PBS. It premiered June 27th. One last question I've got for you. I can't not ask this question because my whole fight with this is you've hit on two things that I love deeply. The one that I'm a professional in, which is history, and the other one being documentary making. And I just want to ask you, the images, how do you pick the images? And there's one thing that I got in there that I think was subtle. When you talk about the rise of Hitler, right, in 1933, you show the striking image of this board light up and it says, "Hail Hitler," right? It's like you're at a Vegas, it's like a Vegas board or something like this, right? It's almost like kind of ridiculous in the context. But then later on, when you're in the McCarthy era, there's a board that lights up that says, "Get rid of all commies," or something like this. And I don't know, but I felt like that was a decision. And the two boards look very similar.
Really?
I was wondering if that was that a conscious decision here? Huh?
Oh, yeah, of course it was. Well, first off, making documentaries, what I love about it, it's a team sport. So we had an amazing team of archive producers, both in the United States and Germany. My co-production partner, Luxfilm in Germany. Our amazing editor, Sabina Krambel, was very involved in obviously picking all the archive that would piece together visually. And my co-director, Shauna Gazit, and co-writer Maya Harris, and producers Sami Lopez. So the archive is an amazing part of the story because it tells the story visually.
Yeah.
And so, yes, there's a lot of things you'll see like that. Pinning a medal on somebody in 1933, pinning a medal on somebody in 1960s. There's a lot of similarities. And it's not that we're trying to always make a point pointedly, but there's subtle things that you could pick up on.
Yeah, I thought it was, when I saw that, I was like, that's, and I probably missed some of it just because, with great documentaries, you got to watch them a couple of times. And I did watch the first half, or maybe the first 30 minutes one, and then go back and start it over again. It's worth watching. And I think it's a good film in the sense that you could watch it again and get something else out of it. But it's made me put Hannah Arendt's reading on some of my summer reading list too, because I think there are, so many ideas in the history of world thought. And at various times, they become more useful than others. And I think this is a well-timed documentary, and one that I think most Americans, I think all Americans, could get something out of watching. So I hope everyone will check it out. Jeff Bieber, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ben. It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or 5 stars on Spotify. Or spread the word directly. Just text a friend maybe, or share a link on social media. Anything helps and we appreciate it. And if you've got a friend who hasn't gotten into podcasts yet, let them know they can hear us every weekend on SiriusXM's POTUS channel 124. Now is the time when we say our special thanks to our supporters on Patreon and give a shout out to our Washingtonians. That list is Tanya Marsh, Mary Hawking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Chris and Teresa Adams, Joy Avery, Edward Carlson, and Aaron and Derek Garrison. Thanks to all you guys for supporting us. If you want to support our work and maybe get on that list, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/theroadtonow. You'll get extended versions of select conversations, extra episodes, bonus materials, and more. That's all available at patreon.com/theroadtonow. For more on the show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can easily search our back catalog and quickly find links to content. Why is it so good? 7 Ages Design. That's who made it. If you're looking for a website, go check them out. The Road to Now is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and me, Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is Gary Fletcher. This episode was edited by Ben Sawyer, and our theme music, like pretty much always, was by Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Thank you for listening. Take care.